welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. Today we're going to be talking about, will the Fed be repeating some of the same mistakes from its past? Kamala Harris's embrace of crypto, which is actually causing some crypto markets to be a little bit happier than normal, and then an interesting story coming out of China about the sinking of one of their nuclear power submarines. And of course, we will end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump into our daily debate. So, as we come to a time when the Fed is currently easing on some of its pressures that it's been placing on different interest rates and trying to actually keep them relatively high compared to history, especially when we basically had a 0% interest rate, there were questions about whether or not the soft landing could actually happen, of course. This is something that Jerome Powell has been aiming for. And there are even jokes going around that if Jerome Powell's able to achieve it, it will be basically his moment to be put in the history books. So, is the soft landing still possible? Are you still skeptical? I hear a lot of people are, but I want to know what you think. Throw it down in the comment section. Want to hear everybody's opinions. But the reason this is coming to mind is because of the talk that is around the possible recession that may be coming. Then again, we've been saying this for 4 years. I mean, I distinctly remember having a conversation almost 3.5 years ago with my cousin, and they said that they thought a recession was coming, and I said, I think it's coming too. And let's be clear, we have very distinct views about politics, human nature, so basically everything. And yet we were able to both say, oh yeah, something's probably coming. So this is not something to be thrown around lightly. This is not something that is just observed by one side. It was definitely a point put out there and something that was absorbed into the popular culture that we were going to see a downturn. Then again, we actually did see a downturn. It was not reported on. The Biden administration basically said, well, it's not really a recession, even though we had two consecutive terms, and by that I mean quarters, of economic, I don't want to say, the best way to put it is we had negative GDP growth. So for 2 quarters, we had negative GDP growth. And let's be clear, the argument is, well, that's not actually a recession because you have to look at the overall numbers. In the common parlance, that is what we would call a recession. That is what we have at least labeled recessions in the past. And we had one, and it wasn't necessarily that long lasting. Some people would say that we're still in a recession. But all of that aside, the point is that it is a strong idea that resonates in the American mind that we're going through some sort of economic hard time, and there's something even bigger coming. Well, ARE, the American Institute of Economic Research, actually put out an article, and they're saying this is a moment that is very similar to the past within the United States history. The headline of this article specifically reads, "Will the Fed repeat 1970s policy mistakes?" And for any of you who were alive in the 1970s, first of all, thank you for joining me on this one. You probably keep up with a lot of the news, and I'm happy that you choose to come here to hear some random young person's opinion. But for anybody who was out there around in the 70s, maybe you don't necessarily know what was happening. Maybe you don't know about the stagflation that came out of that period. Maybe you don't know the problems that faced many young Americans at that point. And that is why when I talk to some of the older people around me, and specifically people that were roughly the same age, maybe 25, 30, they were saying, oh, well, yeah, you guys are dealing with high inflation. We dealt with high inflation too when we were coming into our late teens, early 20s, and some people, when they were actually in their 30s, they're saying we were dealing with it basically up until the time of Reagan. But all of that is to say that this is not necessarily 100% unique. Of course, the moment that led up to this, the different circumstances that led us to this point are unique. That doesn't mean that the consequences and the outcomes are necessarily 100% indescribable or unimaginable, unimaginable, because there are family members of yours that probably have gone through it. So let's actually read through what this argument is and highlight some of the key changes that we would have to make in order to not replicate those same mistakes. Quote, the Federal Reserve's recent decision to cut the federal funds rate by 50 basis points to a range of 4.75% to 5%, despite inflation still exceeding its 2% target, bears alarming similarities to the monetary policy missteps of the late 1970s. Back then, under pressure to stimulate economic activity, the Fed loosened monetary policy too soon. So what they're outlining here is, if you're trying to tamp down on inflation, you're trying to make sure that there's not too much money flowing through the economy, you're going to raise interest rates. And that is one method, of course. There are other technical fiscal policies that could be enabled, but from a monetary policy side, the Fed's going to take that need because, one, guess what? If you actually raise the cost of borrowing money, maybe people don't necessarily hire as many people. Companies can't afford to because they can't take out loans in order to keep them afloat for a little bit longer, meaning less people are making wages. Therefore, they actually don't put more money into the economy. They don't necessarily get those high-paying jobs. But also for the average person, not necessarily a business owner, if it's harder for you to take out money, you're less likely to go get a mortgage, which is putting more money into the system because it's leaving your bank account, which is technically still just a marker because your money is being thrown around by the bank anyway because of our beautiful fractional. Never mind. We'll go into that some other time. But the idea is that your money doesn't just sit in the bank and literally do nothing. The bank, in order to justify being a safe place for your money, is actually loaning that out to other people. And that's how they make their profit off of loans that have interest rates. And for the average person, if they can't necessarily get an interest rate at a lower amount, so say they want a 5% interest rate in order to buy a house, and they end up getting one that's at 10%, they're less likely to actually go forward with that, meaning that there's less money flowing through the economy because less people are buying houses, and therefore you're actually lowering the amount of constant buying, that you're decreasing or at least making it harder for money to flow through the economy in theory, and therefore you will stop seeing as many inflationary spirals because you're actually limiting the amount of money that people are willing to spend just through raising interest rates alone. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Some people would argue there's actually a psychological factor to it, where if people believe they're in an inflationary spiral, they'll buy the products now in order to prevent having to pay higher prices later. And overcoming this psychology is also something that the Fed talks about on a regular basis because they want to portray a certain level of confidence that this is not actually going to be an inflationary spiral that's out of control, and therefore settle the minds of some consumers, which is interesting that psychology plays into economics a little bit as well. It's a very fascinating field for that reason because it is an intersection of so many different things, mainly because the economy is actually not 100% man-made, but basically man-made in its construction. So it's very fascinating, the different factors that go into it. And as our study of the economy evolves, as it has been going on for a long time, monetary policy and fiscal policy have been things that even the Romans and the Stoics were arguing about way, way, way before the birth of Christ. So the fact that this is something that continues to recur and we are constantly reforming our thoughts on it, examining it, it's fascinating, and there's no doubt about that. And that's why I think being an economist is one of those jobs where you don't necessarily know what's going to get thrown at you, especially considering that monetary policy and fiscal policy can be vastly different between administrations, and throughout time, things obviously change, whether it be the idea of quantitative easing, which is something that doesn't necessarily come out of nowhere, but the modern sense of it did. The banking on the future GDP growth and the consistent 2%, all of these different factors are things that weren't necessarily common thoughts coming into the 1900s. And before that, I'm sure there were other policies that I can't name off the top of my head that weren't necessarily common practice, at least within the previous generation, maybe years and years and years ago in different empires and different locations and how they handled their money it was. But there's always new interpretations. We're always synthesizing different methods in order to get what we want, especially through economic controls on the government side, which would leave you to ask the question, should the government be involved? But that's more of a libertarian point, and we won't necessarily go into that one because we don't need to necessarily sit back and say, oh, well, we don't need to think high and mighty. Unfortunately, they are already involved in the process of ensuring that the currency does not necessarily lose its value, and that the currency continues to flow, and that there is a proper stable market in order to allow all these different industries to prosper and innovation to flourish. They're already involved in that process, so now we just need to make sure that they're not making the same mistakes at the least. At the least. Once again, on a principle level, maybe they shouldn't be involved at all, but if we're going to take reality as it is, they already are. So how do we make sure that they don't make the same mistakes? So what's going on here? Quote, what was the result? Inflation soared as high as, if not higher, depending on the inflation measure. This culminated in the Fed Chairman Paul Volcker reining in the money supply, which drove interest rates even higher. The result was necessary, though painful, double-dip recession before inflation persisted at a lower rate, and then the economy expanded during what's been called the Great Moderation, end quote. Now, they move on to actually what's happening currently. Quote, recent Fed decisions come with inflation, though moderating remains elevated. According to the latest Consumer Price Index data, inflation increased 2.5% year over year in August, with core inflation, that's not including the food and energy, rising by 3.2%. The Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, the preferred core inflation measure for the Fed, showed a 2.6% year-over-year increase in July, end quote. So you can also see that there are many different measures here. So whether it be including certain goods, food, gas, things of that nature, and you might want to say, okay, hold on. Is that actually a fair measure of what everybody's having to buy on a daily basis? Maybe we don't necessarily include food and gas in this one. And then the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, which is the one that the Fed actually prefers to use, the definition for that is, quote, reflects changes in the prices of goods and services purchased by customers in the United States quarterly, and annual data are included in the GDP release. So it's a measure of the prices that people living in the United States or those buying on their behalf pay for goods and services, end quote. So you can see how this is something that is obviously going to be a relatively important measure, because if it is looking at the overall expenditures, not necessarily just for American citizens, but basically anybody buying within the American economy, that is going to be something that we want to watch. We want to make sure that even people from outside the United States are getting a fair shot at buying products here to encourage investment. And we've gotten lucky. We've gotten very lucky. We have been the most stable economy out of the world. We have been one of the ones to recover fastest because a lot of people still hold U.S. dollars, even though that is starting to change for sure. A lot of trades are still made in U.S. dollars. A lot of banking transactions and sales of different goods are still made in U.S. dollars. So we have a little bit of resiliency there, and people in other countries are dealing with higher inflation and less stable markets, so they are still putting money into the U.S. economy, or storing it in the stock market at least, in order to have a stable way to ride out some of the uncertainty in the rest of the world. But what does that actually matter? Why does that matter at the end of the day? Why does any of this fiscal policy matter? Because when we start to really unleash the beast, when we say, okay, you know what, we're taking our foot off of the brake here, we're going to let the car ease a little bit here. We're going to let it start to speed up just a little bit more than it's been going, okay? We're not going to go to the gas. We're not going to go zero interest rates again very quickly, but we're going to ease up just a little bit in order to make sure that the car is moving at a good pace. That means that you have faith that people are not going to immediately jump straight back in and take advantage of those lower inflation rates than they were previously, even though they're higher than the ideal, and start stimulating the economy again, and therefore continue purchasing at a high rate, and therefore increasing, if not maintaining, inflation. And that's the game they're trying to play here. It's a really, really tricky one. And if you don't do it right, you will continue to have high inflation without necessarily persistent growth. And stable growth is even more important. That's what you would call stagflation to some degree. There's stagnation within the economy, and yet there is still inflation hitting consumers from left, right, and center. And we've made this mistake before. I don't know if we're going to make it again. I want to believe in my heart of hearts, the part of me that wants to be happy and not live in an inflationary cycle economy is saying, no, I really want the soft landing to work. The part of me that is naturally skeptical is sitting back and saying, I don't know if we're going to reach it from this. We're not at that 2% inflation goal, which is an arbitrary goal anyway, so whatever. But the fact that we at least have the 2% goal and we're not even quite there yet and we're pulling off, that shows that there is a belief that we will still go down. We will still have a downward trajectory in inflation. And don't get me wrong, interest rates are still higher than they were back during Obama and Trump and after 2008, okay? They still are. So some investors still may be waiting for another 0% era, so to speak. But I don't necessarily think that's coming. And I think some people are really going to jump at the opportunity in order to take advantage of those lower interest rates because the Fed basically sets it. They set the rate at which they loan out the money to the banks and all the other institutions with their treasury bonds and everything of that sort. So then the banks are basically going at their behest. They can set their own interest rate, but they're not necessarily going to risk it when they have the Fed backing up and saying, oh, well, this is the rate that we think is actually sustainable. I don't know. I'm not saying that I understand the future. I can see this on a graph and I understand exactly where it's going to go. There are plenty of external factors, whether it be supply shocks, whether it be the upcoming strike, all of these different things are possibilities that could upset the balance that the Fed is trying to play with here. But all we know is that similar policies have been tried and they have led to stagflation in the past. Are we repeating the same mistakes? That's up for you to give me your opinion, because I think I've laid out at least a semi-coherent argument as to why we're repeating some of the issues, even though all of the context around it is not exactly the same. So with that said, let's move on to another economic/financial issue that is adjacent to this one. And actually, I could even argue that the cryptocurrency space is actually doing a little bit better nowadays because of the questioning of the faith of the US dollar, or at least the stability of it. And it's become speculation rather than a hard asset, obviously. But it is always fascinating when some of these rate cuts come out, and if it's something that actually inspires more faith in the US dollar, the cryptocurrencies, they kind of flutter a little bit, and if it's something that makes people question what the future of the US dollar is, more people go to Bitcoin, whether that's institutional buyers or it's just a large swath of the population that says, oh, I have less faith in the US dollar now. It's always fascinating to me. So obviously, based on that context, we're going to be talking about cryptocurrency. This article comes from the HuffPost, and the headline reads, as Harris embraces crypto, her coalition holds for now. This makes sense to a lot of people. She is a California senator. She is San Francisco type, which means she is close to Silicon Valley. So a lot of people were not necessarily surprised when you heard her say that she's going to be a little bit more lenient, or at least willing to explore cryptocurrencies and not necessarily regulate them the exact same way. A lot of crypto bros, quote unquote, we're just using that title there, not saying everybody that's into crypto is a bro, but a lot of crypto bros have essentially said, well, we want someone different than our current leader at the SEC. We want crypto to not necessarily be held in the same light. We want changes. And the vice president has said, oh, well, you know what, we'll at least entertain the ideas. And also, even Mr. Donald Trump, who was really, really courting the Silicon Valley bros / crypto bros when he went to the crypto conference in Nashville, he's been courting them as well. So this is actually it's a logical move on her part because she already has some of the connections there in that region, but also she needs to counter the weight of Donald Trump. And I think that generally, then again, I could be biased to my own, I could be subject to my own biases here, but I do believe that a good chunk of the population likes the idea of having a currency that is not necessarily manipulatable by the US government. Then again, it is speculative, and people can come in and just chuck millions of dollars in, inflate the price, and then slowly sell off in order to make their millions of dollars, if not maybe $100,000 in profit. These big crypto whales could very well do that. It's manipulatable by people with more money because it's basically a free-floating asset that is controlled by demand structure. So, of course, it's a little bit different, the risks that you take in cryptocurrency, but they like the idea that it is not necessarily something where the U.S. government can come in and say, oh, no, Bitcoin is now this price. Then again, they could very well ban it. If it's still a viable means of exchange would be a question, because if the U.S. government bans it and makes sure that there are no payment services that use it, can you actually use it without going on the black market? Does it make that illegal for most of the common people? So on and so forth. There are different ways that they can influence it, but the crypto bros are trying to make sure that that is not something that is even on the table. So let's jump into the middle of the article here. Quote, interviews with crypto supporters, opponents, and Harris allies, however, point to a scenario where Harris may be seeking to correct what moderate Democrats view as a major mistake in the Biden administration, an unwillingness in their eyes to even engage with the business community, including crypto, without wholly abandoning many of the policies the party's progressive wing loves. And the reason that this is something progressives might be hesitant about. I'm not saying that progressives are out here saying, oh, crypto is the worst, because I'm sure there are plenty of progressive institutions, and I would even say activist hubs, that are willing to use crypto as a means of payment that is not necessarily, it is viewable and trackable, but it is not necessarily controlled by a third party, which therefore could be shut down. And that is something that some activists would actually love to be able to use. Now, you're not necessarily anonymous, so that is something that they may not be fond of, but the fact that it's outside the normal payment structures that could very well be shut down, that is something they may actually find very useful. And I feel as though that is something that they wouldn't hate about crypto. What they would hate about crypto is the fact that there are large players that can come in and, one, basically pump the price of Bitcoin and then make it crash and get the average consumer to leave, and then pump up the price of Bitcoin again and play these little big games. Wall Street and all these different investors can come in and sell crypto as a legitimate asset and try to steal people's money. Things like FTX, where they're making fake coins in order to gyp people out of their money. All these sort of things that would be seen as the elite stripping the wealth away from the lower and middle classes. I could see progressives having issue with that. Also, the amount of lack of government oversight sometimes could also make some progressives fearful. Then again, it gets a little bit mixed there, because some progressives don't necessarily trust government to do certain things, but they do trust government on other issues. So the question is always, well, if you trust them there, why don't you trust them there? But there's a natural skepticism towards government. So they might not necessarily immediately say, oh, it needs oversight in these sort of areas because of the examples I provided before. It provides a way for people to work around the current systems that can be very easily tracked. I mean, the FBI can get access to your bank account very easily with search warrants that banks can comply with, but also I'm sure the NSA can very well and very easily, this is speculation, I do not know this for a fact, but could very well access your transactions. I mean, we know the IRS is already starting to crack down on different types of transactions that are going on with you sending money across different payment services like PayPal and things like that, and even through Zelle and wire transfers. So some progressives may be more okay with this sort of system, but I'm 90% certain that other progressives, and most progressives, would definitely be afraid of the unregulated nature of it, because it leaves room for people to be taken advantage of. So what else is this article talking about besides the pivot and how some people see it as a strategical good play versus other people who don't necessarily? Quote, but a slightly more friendly approach to Silicon Valley, Harris mentioned AI, quantum computing, and the blockchain as sectors that will define the nation in the next century, in an economic speech in Pittsburgh on Wednesday, does not inherently mean an abandonment of many of the labor-friendly, climate change-fighting industrial policies the Biden administration has pursued. And whether I agree that this is actually going to be a continuation of the Biden administration, because Kamala Harris has said, I am not Biden, and she has tried to distance herself from the losses of the Biden administration while also trying to maintain the victories, which is any politician's job to do. I don't know if she's necessarily doing it successfully, and I would be remiss if I did not point it out. But to move on from there, to not play politics and play the game of, well, you can't get away with this, because that is the idea of this. If Trump says something crazy, I'm going to point it out, and if I think it's bad, I'm going to say it. If Kamala Harris says something crazy and I think it's bad, I'm going to say it. But I do want to move on from just the criticizing of the candidates, because I think the overall point is more interesting. The fact that she recognizes she has to lean into the small business, even big business sort of mentality of ensuring that they have a stronger position as a Democratic Party, at least as a Democratic candidate, about the economy and the flourishing of innovation is promising. It means that the Republicans' messaging around businesses and innovation is actually effective, and that the Democratic Party are fully aware of it. And it is another one of those moments where she's kind of pivoting towards the middle, which could be good in the long term. There are plenty of other places where she is not pivoting to the middle. Don't get it twisted. But this is one of them. And it shows that she at least has an understanding of what the average American wants in certain cases, which is actually a good thing. Because guess what? We do not want someone who is only the candidate for the progressive wing of their party, or the more far to any given side person for their party, if that makes any sense. So more far right or far left, and they're only dictating and governing for those people, because then the middle will be left out. And whether or not I agree with the middle and everything, and whether or not I think the people need to be shepherded in either given direction, that doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, you're meant to represent as many people as possible, and the best way to do that is to be in the middle, because then you're probably going to rein in some on the right and some on the left. So having an understanding of where the middle is very important, and obviously some of the messaging that the Republicans have been using for a long time is resonating, and it is interesting and important to note these sort of pivots and changes. Whether or not it actually happens, that is different, but in rhetoric alone, it is important to note these and hold our politicians to account and put their feet, quote unquote, to the fire. We love that trope, but it is true. She's saying it. Now we just got to hold her to it. If she wins, which I think at this point, it seems a little bit more likely. It is her race to lose. It is her race to mess up. That is what I believe at this point. If she wins, then you better darn well hold her feet to the fire on this and not let her just get away with blank rhetoric. And whether or not you agree with any of those other policies, fair enough. You don't necessarily like them, but the ones that you listen to and you said, actually, that seems a little bit moderate, that seems like a good thing, make sure you're holding her to account at the end of the day, because she has said it. And I'm not saying all the policies are going to be good. I'm not saying all the policies are going to be bad either. I'm not trying to just blanket say one thing or another. What I'm saying is, even if it is blank rhetoric intentionally, that does not mean that she is not saying it, and that does not mean she cannot be held account for what she says. And we have to keep our politicians honest. You may not like Kamala Harris. You may not like a lot of her policies. I am right there with you. Do not once again, I'll say it, do not get it twisted. But you have to pay attention to what she's saying, not just the talking points about all the evil things that she said in the past, but the things she's saying right now. So even if you do not get what you necessarily want out of this election, you can make sure that she is an honest politician, or at least she is criticized and made sure to remember the moderate American is there. So we spent a lot of time on this one, and I am extremely sorry that we don't get to spend more time on this last article. I think it's fascinating. If you want to read the entire thing, please go to the link in the description below that like and subscribe button. It is a very interesting story. The fact that this has been covered up for as long as it has. The headline from the Wall Street Journal reads, "Exclusive. China's newest nuclear submarine sank, setting back its military modernization." And the fact that this was covered up, this is something that the Chinese government did not necessarily want to get out there, whether because they didn't want the U.S. to see it, or they didn't want to seem weak to their own population, or they didn't want to show the fact that their new military how should I say, technology is actually faulty, that there are problems in it, you basically don't want to let this out because it can be a big blow in the propaganda war, so to speak. And China has a very, very specific way that they manage their image around the world, whether it be just denying facts that aren't actually, they say that, oh yeah, no, that's just not a thing. Nope, we haven't seen that policy here. Maybe you should readdress some of your information processes and understand that this is false information about China to either save face on the world stage or to save face in front of their people. They're very proud. They're a very proud nation, and they're very, very good at doing the little skirt game and pretending certain things don't happen. This is what they were trying to do here. Quote, China's newest nuclear attack submarine sank in the spring, a major setback for one of the country's priority weapons programs, the U.S. official said. The episode, which China authorities scrambled to cover up and hasn't previously been disclosed, occurred at a shipyard near Wuhan in late May or early June. And that may feel like a long time ago, but this is now we actually have it confirmed. After all this time, it has been confirmed. And that is, I don't want to say something we should celebrate. Because, one, we don't necessarily like the fact that a nuclear submarine is damaged. Maybe there's pollution. We don't necessarily know, even though the idea is that the hazmat teams have not necessarily been there at the amount that we would assume they would if there was some sort of nuclear leak there. And also, we would never want anybody to lose their lives, human beings, and whether or not they're from a evil country. And let's be clear, I'm not just categorizing China as an evil country. I'm using a absolute extreme to prove my point. Even if they were from an evil country and they are simply a part of the military machine, you do not inherently want lives to be lost, especially when we're not at war with them and we're not defending our own country, but just because something's saying we would not want that to happen. But also, it is a momentous, how should I say, occasion when, one, there is a security failure, or at least a failure enough that we're able to detect something like this happening, but also it is a win for the U.S. in the propaganda war. Oh, China can't even get their submarine straight. But also, in the broader war and the battle for supreme technology, these sort of setbacks are very, very important. One, because it may prove there's a technical failure in the way that they're processing the manufacturing of this product and these different weapons, which show flaws, which are necessarily good to have in your enemy's equipment. But also, it could very well cause them to be more cautious, which means they're going to be slower when making these new pieces of technology. They have to be more worried while they're doing it, which could benefit us in the long term. But like I said, we don't want people to lose their lives haplessly. We don't want to praise anything like that. It is the sinking of the submarine that was a good thing, not the people that possibly lost their lives on it, or anybody that might be exposed to any radiation that came from a nuclear-powered submarine that sank. So, with that said, I don't want to have too dreary of a topic, so let's move on to our daily delight. And this story is obviously one of those things where we're trying to pick everybody up. So, if you want to see it, I would suggest you do, because it's a hedgehog yawning, and it is both cute and feral. So headline is that, but it comes from Boing Boing, and basically it's this little guy being a little bit of a crazy mother, going around yawning. It's going into his little ball. It's honestly a little ball of excitement, and we want to leave you on a positive note. So like I said, all the articles, including this one, will be in the links in the description below. That like and subscribe button. You go down there, you can read all of them. You can see some of the videos attached to this one. Absolutely adorable. If you want to check out the podcast on the RSS feed, it comes out on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine. You can find all of it there. It's audio only. Also, what will be showing up in that RSS feed and here on the YouTube channel on Tuesday and Thursday is 6 and 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less. It's our international segment that we're doing now, so you get a little bit more international news. It's not just U.S. focused. And the China story, we brought that up today because it is international focused, but also it directly relates to America and one of the rising superpowers that will probably, I say probably, challenge us on the world stage. And if not challenge us, at least worry us. And we need to make sure that we are at least focusing on these potential enemies, especially when they have very different worldviews and processes for governing their people that could limit freedom. But that's enough. Sorry, I'm in the outro. I don't need to be proselytizing about my China stances. That's fair enough. But the international segment, I try not to have much opinion in there. It is just the news just coming from Reuters, BBC, AP, and having them cited. I also have the sources there. You can go read the entire articles. Just bringing you the news in a quick, consumable fashion. And also on Tuesdays over at Twitter, the Twitter tirade, it's less scripted. That comes out at the same time. And it is really just off the top of my head kind of thinking, really fleshing out different ideas. It's not necessarily well formed. Sometimes I say really stupid things, and I've gone back and listened to some, and I've been like, oh, yeah, no, that was really stupid at the time. But just cultivating different ideas and experimenting with thinking about different things, it's always fascinating. It's always fun, and it's kind of like a little sit down where I just yell. I basically just talk at the wall. That's the whole point. It's a Twitter tirade. So, with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.